He rolled his eyes. Every time I asked for help while pregnant, then laughed and called me useless, so I made sure he learned the truth in front of everyone he loved. My husband looked me dead in the eye, 7 months pregnant, and told me I was being useless. I stood there with a stack of dirty dishes in my hands and I didn't say a word. My lower back had been on fire since 4 that afternoon. The cabinet over the stove was the one shelf I still couldn't reach without going up on my toes, and going up on my toes now felt like standing on a ladder made of jello. I'd asked him 3 times that week. Just that one shelf. Just put the plates away when you're done drying them. Grant, I said, my voice flat with exhaustion, can you get these? My back is killing me. He didn't look up from his phone. He was scrolling something, thumb moving fast, mouth twitching at whatever he was reading. In a minute, he said. A minute became 15. I stood at the counter with the plates stacked against my belly, testing my balance, testing my patience. When I asked again, softer this time, he sighed like I'd asked him to donate a kidney. You know, he said, setting the phone face down like it cost him something. Pregnancy isn't an excuse to be useless. He laughed after he said it, a short laugh, almost surprised at himself, like the joke had just occurred to him mid-sentence and he liked it too much not to use it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Not right then. I set the plates down on the counter, one at a time, careful not to chip them, and I walked past him and turned off the kitchen light. He didn't even notice I'd left the room. I heard the television come back on behind me, some late-night rerun, laughter that wasn't mine. I lay in bed that night with my hands folded over the shelf of my stomach, feeling her move, and I thought about the word he'd used. Useless, not tired, not overwhelmed, not pregnant, useless, like I was a broken appliance he'd married by accident. I thought, too, about the egg retrieval 2 years earlier, the one that actually worked on the second try, and how Grant had been 40 minutes late to the surgical center that morning because he'd stopped to get himself breakfast first, and had walked in eating a sausage biscuit while I sat in a paper gown answering intake questions alone. He'd apologized for that one. He'd meant it, I think, at the time. But apologies, I was starting to understand, were a currency he spent freely because they cost him nothing and changed nothing about what he'd do the next time. I didn't know yet that in 5 days, 31 people would watch him learn exactly how wrong he was. I didn't know his own mother would be the one to finish the lesson. I just knew, lying there in the dark, that something in me had quietly, permanently closed. We'd been trying for this baby for 3 years. 3 years of ovulation apps and temperature charts and a drawer in our bathroom that filled up with negative tests until I couldn't look at the drawer anymore. 2 rounds of IVF, $14,400 out of pocket after insurance chipped in what little it would. 100 nights of hoping in the dark, and at least that many mornings of quiet crying in bathrooms with the fan running so Grant wouldn't hear. When the test finally turned positive, in our bathroom on Larkmore Lane on a Sunday morning in July, Grant cried before I did. He sat down on the edge of the tub, put his face in his hands, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet and his voice cracked. "We're really doing this," he said. He pulled me into him, careful like I might break. "We're really doing this, Dana." I believed him. God help me, I believed in that word. We. I was 30 years old that summer. Grant was 33. We'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Akron 8 years earlier, married in June of 2021 in a backyard in North Canton with string lights and his grandmother's lace tablecloth on the gift table, and bought the house on Larkmore 2 years after that for $214,000, a starter home with good bones and a kitchen that needed new cabinets we never got around to installing. I worked as a paralegal at Hobart & Klein, a family law firm downtown, mostly divorce and custody filings, which meant I spent my days reading about marriages coming apart and driving home each night grateful mine wasn't one of them. Grant managed a territory for Cardinal Auto Supply, 3 counties of Hart's distributors, a company car, an expense account for lunches with buyers he called relationship maintenance. We met at a mutual friend's 4th of July barbecue in Akron, 8 years before any of this, back when I was 22 and still new enough to Ohio to think everyone there was that easygoing. Grant showed up late with a case of beer and no chair, charmed an old woman named Delphine into giving up her lawn chair for an hour, and spent that hour talking to me about nothing in particular, in a way that felt, at the time, like being chosen. He called the next day. He kept calling. For a long stretch of years, that ease read as generosity. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to notice that the same charm he spent on strangers, he mostly withheld from the actual work of a house and a marriage. The early years were good, genuinely, not a performance I'm reconstructing now to make the ending sting more. He learned how I took my coffee before we'd said, "I love you." He drove 4 hours each way one November to sit with me at my grandfather's funeral in Pittsburgh, and never once complained about missing a football weekend with Trevor to do it. We had a rhythm back then that felt like partnership. He cooked on Sundays, I handled the bills, we split the rest without ever needing a spreadsheet to enforce it. I don't think either of us noticed exactly when the split stopped being even. It happened the way most erosion happens, one small, unremarked concession at a time, until one day I looked up and realized I'd been carrying the whole structure alone for so long I couldn't remember agreeing to it. The pattern had a dry run before the baby too, back in 2022, a year and a half into the marriage. Grant lost his job at Speedway Auto Parts that spring, let go after missing 3 straight quarters of sales targets, though the official reason on the paperwork was restructuring. The real reason, which I only pieced together later from a coworker's wife at a Christmas party, was that he'd spent a good chunk of those quarters on long lunches with Trevor instead of running his routes. He told me it was restructuring. I believed him, the way I believed most things he told me back then, and I picked up every freelance proofreading contract I could find for 4 straight months to cover our mortgage while he figured things out, working nights at our kitchen table after full days at the firm. When Cardinal Auto Supply finally hired him that August, he came home glowing, called his mother before he called me, and told the story afterward at every family dinner for a year as a tale of his own grit and hustle. He never once mentioned the 4 months I'd spent typing until midnight so we wouldn't lose the house. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed it. He wasn't a bad man. I want to say that plainly because it matters, and because the version of this story where he's a cartoon villain isn't the true one. Grant was funny at parties. He remembered his coworkers' kids' names. He cried at his own wedding and cried again in that bathroom in July. But there was a pattern underneath the good parts, one I'd spent years quietly reorganizing my expectations around instead of naming out loud, and pregnancy didn't create that pattern. Pregnancy just turned the volume up until I couldn't pretend not to hear it anymore. The pattern had a history. At our wedding, Grant disappeared for 2 hours the morning of, supposedly running an errand for his own boutonniere, and came back smelling like a bar and looking sheepish, while his mother, Carol, quietly rearranged the seating chart he'd promised to finish and never had. Carol didn't make a scene. She just fixed it, the way I would learn she fixed most things Grant left unfinished, and handed him a rum and coke like nothing had happened. I asked her about it once, years later, half joking, the two of us drying dishes after a Thanksgiving dinner Grant had helped with by carving the turkey and then vanishing to watch football. I asked why everyone always just quietly picked up his slack instead of making him deal with it. Carol went still for a second, dish towel in her hands, and then she said it plainly, like a fact she'd made peace with a long time ago. "Honey," she said, "I stopped asking his father for things in 1994. I didn't push. Something in her voice told me not to. I filed it away instead. I always do. It's a habit from the job. You learn that the detail nobody explains is usually the one that matters most later, so you write it down and you wait. I found out more, in pieces, over the years. Grant's father, Roger, had left when Grant was 3 weeks old in the dead cold of January 1994, and Carol had raised him alone in a 2-bedroom rental in North Canton on a receptionist's salary, and then later on wages from the fabric barn where she still worked part-time at 61. Grant almost never talked about his father. When the subject came up, even sideways, his jaw would tighten, and he'd change the subject fast. And once, early in our relationship, when I gently compared some small avoidant habit of his to something Carol had mentioned about Roger, he'd snapped at me harder than I'd ever seen him snap. "I'm nothing like my father," he said. "I don't even know the guy. Don't ever say that to me again." I never did. I just filed it next to 1994, next to the seating chart, next to a dozen other small moments that didn't mean anything on their own, but were starting by the time I was pregnant to add up to something I didn't have a name for yet. One of those moments happened early. Our first year married, a fender bender on 77 South in a spring rainstorm that wasn't really anyone's fault. A driver hydroplaning into the back of us at a dead stop. Grant was shaken enough afterward that he sat on the guardrail with his head in his hands, while I stood in the rain exchanging insurance information with the other driver, calling our agent, arranging the tow, filling out the accident report the trooper handed me because Grant, when the trooper addressed him directly, just gestured vaguely at me and said, "She's better at this stuff than I am." I remember thinking at the time that it was sweet, almost, him trusting me that completely. It took years for me to understand that "she's better at this stuff" was never really a compliment. It was an early draft of a sentence he'd go on to say, in one form or another, about nearly everything hard for the rest of our marriage. The pregnancy should have been the thing that finally proved it wrong. Instead, it became the thing that finally proved it right. The nausea hit around week 6, and it hit like a bill collector, relentless and unembarrassed. I begged Grant to skip his morning coffee, just until I could stand being near the smell of it without gagging into the kitchen sink. He agreed easily, almost gallantly, like it cost him nothing. He lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, I came downstairs to the smell of it filling the whole kitchen and found him leaning against the counter, mug in hand, scrolling his phone like nothing had ever been asked of him. "Grant, the coffee," I said, one hand already over my mouth. "Oh, sorry, forgot," he said, and didn't move it, and didn't apologize again. And I ran up the stairs instead of arguing, because arguing while dry heaving felt like a losing proposition. By week 9, I heard him on the phone with Trevor Boyle, his best friend since Jackson High School, out in the garage with the door cracked while he did push-ups between sentences. I wasn't trying to listen. I was carrying laundry past the door. "She's milking it a little, man," Grant said, breathing hard between reps. "Everyone's pregnant. Half the office has had a baby. My mom didn't lie around for 9 months, she just did it." I stood in the hallway with a laundry basket against my hip, and I didn't go in. I didn't confront him. I carried the basket to the bedroom, folded the towels, and added it to the file. He showed up for the parts of pregnancy that photographed well. He came to the gender reveal at his mother's house in October, cut into the cake with me in front of everyone, and when the inside came up pink, he lifted me half off the ground laughing, genuinely thrilled, and I let myself believe for one whole afternoon that this was who he really was. He painted a corner of the nursery a soft sage green and posted the sonogram to his page with a caption about being the luckiest guy in Ohio, and it got 206 likes, and Trevor commented a string of fire emojis, and Grant screenshotted it and sent it to me like a gift. He skipped my glucose screening in November. I'd written it on the shared calendar 3 separate times, texted him the morning of, and still sat alone in a lab chair drinking the too sweet orange syrup while his calendar, when I checked it later out of some masochistic curiosity, said Jim, Legs Day. When I brought it up that night, tired, not even angry yet, just confused, he looked genuinely wounded. You never told me it was that day, he said. You can't just assume I remember everything. I didn't argue. I pulled up the calendar entry, the timestamp on the text, and set my phone on the counter between us without a word. He looked at it for a second too long and then shrugged, the way you shrug off a parking ticket. Okay, my bad, he said, in a tone that made clear it wasn't actually his bad. It was just a sentence he was willing to say to end the conversation. The anatomy scan happened the same week, the 20-week ultrasound where they check every finger and chamber of the heart. The appointment I'd circled on the calendar back in September because it was the one I'd told him, more than once, that I really didn't want to sit through alone. He showed up 40 minutes late, sliding into the chair beside me just as the tech was finishing, missing the moment we found out we were having a girl, missing the 10 full minutes I'd spent crying quietly in the dark of the ultrasound room by myself while the tech pretended not to notice. He blamed a call that ran long with a distributor in Massillon. I believed the call happened. I no longer believed it had to run that long. Around the same time, the sciatica started. A hot electric line running down my right leg every time I stood too fast. Bad enough some nights that I couldn't find a position in bed that didn't make me gasp. I mentioned it to Grant twice, hoping for nothing more than for him to grab the heating pad from the closet instead of me climbing the stairs to get it myself. You always find something, he said the second time, not even looking up. Every week, it's something new. I didn't have the energy to explain that a body changing that fast for the first time in 30 years was going to keep finding new things to complain about, that this wasn't a character flaw, it was physiology. I got the heating pad myself. I always did. I built us a shared task list after that. Simple thing. A shared app, chores and appointments, and errands split down the middle, color-coded, gentle. I thought maybe the problem was logistics, not character. I thought if I made it easy enough, visible enough, he'd step into it. He muted the notifications within a week. When I asked him about it, he didn't deny it. I don't need an app telling me what a bad husband I am every hour, he said. And somehow, in his telling, I had become the aggressor, and he the wounded party, and I stood there in my own kitchen genuinely unsure for a second whether I'd done something wrong. That's the part nobody warns you about, not the big cruelty. The small repeated confusion of being told, calmly and reasonably, that your own reasonable request is actually an attack. I asked him to handle his own family's shower reply texts in December, once his mother had helped me set a date. He forwarded every single one back to me with a thumbs up emoji and no explanation. 31 guests worth of texts, RSVPs and dietary restrictions and gift registry questions, all of it landing back in my inbox like a boomerang he'd never intended to actually throw away. I mentioned to Carol, lightly over the phone, that I was handling most of the shower logistics myself. I wasn't trying to complain. I was just tired and talking. He told me you like being in charge of things like that, Carol said, careful, diplomatic. Said you get territorial about it. I sat with that for a second. Territorial. Like I'd fought him for the job instead of being handed it, again, by default, because the alternative was watching it not get done at all. Somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, nesting instinct kicking in hard, I spent a Saturday clearing out the hallway closet to make room for baby things. Behind a box of Christmas ornaments, I found an old shoebox, corners soft with age, a single letter R written on the lid in blue marker. I lifted the lid out of pure curiosity and found a stack of envelopes, a dozen or more, addressed to Grant Sorensen in adult, careful handwriting, postmarked from Cleveland across a span of years. I didn't have time to fully read before I heard Carol's car in the driveway. She'd come by to drop off a crib mobile. I put the lid back on fast, some instinct telling me this wasn't mine to look through, and when I mentioned it to her later, just in passing, asked what it was, her face did something I'd never seen it do. That's old business, sweetheart, she said, already moving toward a different topic. Leave it be. I left it be. I filed it, next to 1994, next to I'm nothing like my father, and I didn't think about it again until the night everything came apart in a living room full of 31 witnesses. There was money underneath all of it too, small and specific, the kind of detail that doesn't sound like much until you add it up. In early December, I noticed our joint savings account, the one we'd nicknamed the baby fund, down $600 from where it should have been. When I asked Grant about it, he didn't flinch. Renewed my membership at Skyline, he said. I work hard, Dana. I deserve something for myself. It feels like the second you got pregnant, this whole house started revolving around the baby, and I stopped mattering. I stood in the kitchen, holding a mug of decaf, and looked at my husband, $600 poorer and somehow now cast as the neglected party, and I said the only thing I could think to say. The baby isn't born yet, Grant. The house isn't revolving around her. It's revolving around me, and I'm the one who's supposed to matter to you right now. He didn't have an answer for that. He just picked his phone back up, and I understood, standing there, that this conversation, like all the others, was already over, whether I agreed to end it or not. At my 28-week appointment in early November, my blood pressure came back high enough that Dr. Kessler, my OB, sat me down and used the word preeclampsia out loud for the first time, gently but clearly, and sent me home with a blood pressure cuff and strict instructions to check it twice a day, log it, and call immediately if it climbed past a certain number. She asked pointedly if I had someone at home who could help me remember, could sit with me for the 2 minutes it took, could notice if I looked off in a way I might not notice about myself. I told Grant that night, laid it all out plainly. The number to watch for, the symptoms, headaches, vision changes, swelling that didn't go down, the seriousness in Dr. Kessler's voice that I tried to make sure carried into my own. He nodded along, asked a couple of questions that sounded responsible in the moment, and then, 3 days later, when I asked if he'd set a reminder on his phone to check in with me at the times we'd agreed on, he waved a hand like I was overcomplicating a non-issue. Doctors always throw the P word around with first-time moms, he said. It's a liability thing. My mom never had any of that and she was fine. Your mom also didn't have anyone monitoring anything, Grant. That's not reassuring, that's just lucky. He didn't set the reminder. I set 2 of my own, tracked the numbers myself in a notebook I kept in my nightstand, and when I mentioned, exhausted, one evening in early December, that I was scared, actually scared, of what could happen if the numbers kept climbing and nobody but me was paying attention, he told me I was letting the internet get in my head and I should stop reading pregnancy forms before bed. I stopped mentioning it to him after that. I just kept checking and logging and calling Wendy instead when the numbers worried me, because at least she understood exactly what the numbers meant and never once made me feel dramatic for asking. There was a dinner in late November at our friends Priya and Sam's place across town. 6 of us around a table loud with wine Grant drank and I couldn't. Somewhere between the appetizers and the entree, telling a story about a distributor meeting, he made a joke about how I'd taken to waddling around the house like a penguin looking for its keys, and the table laughed, the easy reflexive laugh people give a joke that isn't really about them, and I laughed too because what else do you do at someone else's dinner table? I didn't say anything to him that night. I didn't need to make a scene over a joke. I said something the next morning instead, calm, over coffee, told him it had actually stung more than he probably meant it to, that I'd spent the whole ride home replaying it. He looked genuinely bewildered. It was a joke, Dana. Everyone laughed. You laughed. I laughed because I was embarrassed, not because it was funny. You're being sensitive, he said, not cruelly, more like a diagnosis he was fully confident in. Pregnancy hormones. My mom said she cried at commercials when she was carrying me. I didn't bring up his mother's actual experience of that pregnancy, the one where the man she was carrying that baby for was 3 months from walking out the door. I just finished my coffee and went to work, and added the word sensitive to the file, right below territorial and milking it, a small growing glossary of every reasonable feeling he'd found a way to rename. By the Tuesday of the dishes, I was 30 weeks along. My back had been in open revolt for a month, and I had asked my husband for help so many times in so many small, reasonable ways that I'd started keeping a mental tally without meaning to. The task list he muted, the glucose test he skipped, the texts he forwarded back, the $600, the phone call with Trevor. Each one had felt, in the moment, like surely the ceiling, surely the worst of it, and each time he found a way underneath it, or a joke that went one layer lower than the last. Useless was the floor. I didn't know yet that it wouldn't be the last word he'd regret saying. I just knew, standing in the dark kitchen after he'd said it and laughed, that I was done asking him to be someone he apparently had no intention of becoming on his own. I called my sister Wendy from the driveway the next morning, before I'd even gone back inside. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Wendy is an ER nurse at Altman, 5 years older than me, and nothing rattles her. She's watched grown men faint at the sight of their own blood and calmly kept working. I told her everything. The dishes, the useless, the laugh that came after it, and she listened without interrupting until I ran out of words. Do you want to leave him? She asked finally. Or educate him? I sat in my cold car in my own driveway and thought about that word, useless, and about my mother-in-law saying 1994 like a closed door, and about 3 years of trying and $14,000 and 100 nights of quiet crying. And I made a decision that surprised even me with how calm it felt. Educate him, I said. The baby shower was 5 days out, already planned for that Saturday at our house. 31 guests confirmed. I called Wendy back an hour later with a plan half-formed, and by that evening it was whole. We were moving the shower to her house across town. Same date, same guest list, same everything. Except this time, Grant would run it, every detail. I typed up a 2-page list that night at the kitchen table while he watched television 20 feet away, oblivious, and I put his name in the owner column 31 separate times. Cake, chairs, drinks, decorations, his own family's dietary notes, all of it, his. I handed it to him the next morning over coffee. The shower's moving to Wendy's, I said. You're running it. He glanced at the list, glanced at me, and shrugged in a way that told me he still had absolutely no idea what was coming. Fine, he said. It's cleaning and snacks. How hard can it be? I didn't answer that. I just smiled, small and private, and refilled my coffee and let him find out. Wendy came over that same afternoon while Grant was at work, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and read the 2-page list line by line, nodding slowly, like a surgeon reviewing a chart. He's going to call me at least 4 times, she predicted. I give it 6, I said. I'll answer the first 2 like it's an emergency line and tell him I'm too busy for the rest. He called her 3 times that week, in fact, and by her account, he sounded a little more frantic each time, though she gave him almost nothing to work with. A location for the folding tables, a firm no when he asked if she could just handle the cake thing since she probably knew a guy, and on the last call, a flat refusal to referee an argument he was apparently having with himself out loud out about balloon ratios. Wednesday, the bakery called our house line about an unpaid balance, $185 for the cake Grant had ordered and never actually paid the deposit on, a detail he'd apparently filed away the same careless way he filed everything else. He had to drive across town during his lunch hour to settle it in person, and came home irritated, like the bakery had personally inconvenienced him by expecting payment for goods rendered. Thursday, the guest bathroom sink at Wendy's started draining slow, and Grant, determined to prove he could handle things without calling anyone, tried baking soda and vinegar he'd seen in a video somewhere. He flooded the bathroom floor instead, water creeping under the door into the hallway, and had to call an actual plumber, Ferris Plumbing, who fixed it in 11 minutes for $240 and gave Grant one long, deeply unimpressed look on his way out the door. Friday, he attempted the appetizers himself, insisting he didn't need my help, and burned 2 full trays of the little puff pastry things his mother had requested, filling Wendy's kitchen with smoke and setting off the detector twice. Wendy stood in the doorway with a dish towel, fanning the alarm, and called through the smoke, not unkindly, "You know there's a recipe on the box, right?" He didn't answer her. He just opened a window and started over with the oven timer set for real this time, muttering to himself in a way I only heard about secondhand. That same evening, he lost a genuine, prolonged battle with 40 helium balloons in the back of his own car, arriving at Wendy's with static-charged latex stuck to every surface of the interior, and an expression like a man who had personally been betrayed by physics. He tracked balloon residue into the house on his shoes. Wendy handed him a lint roller without a word and went back to her own preparations, and he spent 20 minutes on his knees in her front hallway, defeated by static cling, while I sat on the couch with my feet up, sipping ginger tea, and said absolutely nothing. By Saturday morning, my husband had barely slept. I watched him vacuum a rug for what I was fairly sure was the first time in his adult life. I watched him iron a tablecloth so badly it came out with a scorch mark he had to hide under a centerpiece. I watched him carry a 2-tier cake through actual rain, hunched over it like it was live ammunition, jaw set, shirt soaked through by the time he got it inside. His grandmother, Frances Sorensen, Grandma Fran to everyone, 84 years old, 4 kids raised on a dairy farm outside Louisville with a husband who worked from before dawn until after dark, watched him haul a folding table down Wendy's hallway, drenched, red-faced, a roll of paper towels tucked under one arm because he'd run out of napkins and hadn't had time to buy more. "You look busy," she said mildly. From her spot in the good armchair someone had already set up for her. "There's more to a shower than I thought," Grant panted, and for just a second, just 1 second, before he caught himself and smoothed his face back into something more composed, I saw something on him I hadn't seen in months. Not resentment, not performance, just plain honest exhaustion, the kind I'd been carrying alone since July. I sat on Wendy's couch with my feet up and a blood pressure cuff within arm's reach, and I did not move to help him. Not once. Not even when he dropped a tray of napkin rings and had to crawl under the coffee table to collect them while I watched from 6 feet away with a glass of ice water in my hand. My sister made absolutely sure of that. Every time I so much as shifted my weight to stand, she materialized beside me with a hand on my shoulder and a look that said, "Sit." The house smelled like vanilla frosting and wet umbrellas by early afternoon. String lights Wendy had hung along the mantel glowing soft against the gray December light outside. I moved slow through the rooms greeting people, one hand always at the small of my back, aware of exactly how far I was from any chair at any given moment, the way you get in your 3rd trimester, tracking exits the way other people track clocks. The party itself ran mostly on Grant's sweat. The cake looked fine once the scorch mark was hidden. The chairs were arranged right. Grandma Fran had her armchair by the window. Guests trickled in through the afternoon, laughing, eating, putting their hands on my belly and telling me I was glowing. And for an hour or two it felt almost normal, almost like any other family gathering, and some small tired part of me let itself relax. Then Wendy stood up in the middle of the living room with a stack of blank index cards and a fistful of pens. "New game," she announced, bright and easy, like this was just another shower activity. "Write down one thing you wish someone had done for you when you were pregnant. Doesn't have to be about anyone specific. No names, fold it once, pass it back to me." Every woman in that room started writing almost immediately, pens moving fast, no hesitation at all, like they'd all been waiting years for someone to ask. Carol wrote something. Grandma Fran, 84 years old and 4 decades removed from her own pregnancies, wrote something too, her hand steady and sure. My own mother, down from Massillon for the day, wrote something with her mouth pressed into a thin line I recognized from every argument she and my father ever had in front of me as a kid. Wendy collected the folded cards into a stack, shuffled them once, and started reading them out loud in a light conversational tone that made the whole room go quiet in a completely different way than it had been quiet before. "Bring me water without me having to ask twice," she read. Someone laughed, short and knowing. Someone else made a small sound in the back of their throat that wasn't quite a laugh at all. "Believe me the first time I say something hurts." The room had gone very still by then. 31 people and one enormous unspoken agreement settling over all of them at once. Then my sister crossed the living room, walked straight up to my husband, and pulled the stack of dirty paper plates right out of his hands. She replaced them, deliberately, with the rest of the folded cards. "Your turn," she said, not unkindly, but not softly either. "Read them out loud." Grant looked down at the cards in his hands like they might be hot to the touch. Then he looked at me, across the room, feet up on the couch, one hand resting on the belly he'd called useless 5 days earlier. Then he looked at his mother, mother, who had gone very still and very quiet, hands folded in her lap, sitting the way I imagine you sit when you've been waiting 30 years for a moment you never asked for and can't stop now that it's arrived. The rain had picked up outside, tapping against Wendy's windows, and for a second that was the only sound in the whole house. He unfolded the first card. His hands weren't steady. "Don't tell me I'm doing too much when I'm doing exactly what you asked," he read, voice already smaller than I'd ever heard it in public. Nobody said anything. He unfolded the next one. "Show up to the appointments, not just the fun ones." A muscle worked in his jaw. He kept going, because 31 people were watching, and there was no version of stopping that didn't look worse than finishing. "Don't make me ask twice for something that takes you 2 minutes. Don't tell me I'm milking it. I'm growing an organ your body will never have to grow." A ripple went through the room at that one. A few sharp intakes of breath. Someone's fork setting down against a plate with a small, deliberate click. Grant's ears had gone red. He didn't look up from the card in his hand. "Don't renew a golf membership with the baby fund and then tell me I made the house all about the baby." That one landed harder than any before it. I hadn't written that card. I hadn't needed to. Somewhere in that room, someone I'd mentioned it to in passing over the past month had turned my offhand complaint into ammunition I never asked them to load. And for a second I caught Wendy's eye across the room and understood, from the small, satisfied set of her mouth, exactly who. "Handle your own family's texts. Don't say we're pregnant if I'm the only one doing any of the work." Each card landed like its own small, specific verdict. And I watched something in my husband get smaller with everyone. Watched him glance toward the door once like he was calculating the distance. Watched his mother's face stay perfectly, carefully still beside him. There was one card left in the stack. He unfolded it, and I saw his whole posture change before he'd even finished reading it silently to himself first. His shoulders dropping, his face draining of the little color it had left, his eyes moving back to the top of the card like he needed to read it again to be sure he hadn't imagined it. I knew that handwriting. I'd seen it on birthday cards for 8 years. Careful and looping and unmistakably Carol's. "Read it," Wendy said quietly, and it wasn't a request anymore. Grant's hand was shaking now, visibly, the card trembling between his fingers. He looked at his mother. She didn't look away from him, didn't reach for the card, didn't try to take it back. She just held his gaze, and something passed between them that had clearly been sitting unsaid in that family for over 30 years, waiting for exactly this kind of room to finally come out in. "Mom," he said, low, almost a question. "Read it, Grant," Carol said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. I could see that much from across the room. He read it out loud, and his voice cracked halfway through, and by the time he finished, the only sound in the entire house was the rain. "Please don't ever tell your son he's useless," he read. "That's what his father said to me 3 weeks after he was born, right before he packed a bag and left. I never told Grant that. I didn't want it to be true twice." The room didn't gasp. It was quieter than that. A collective held breath. 30 people suddenly understanding something they hadn't been in the room to witness the first time it happened, decades ago, in a house none of them had ever seen. I watched Grant's face come apart in slow motion. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something rawer than either of those. Something that looked almost like grief or a version of himself he'd never known he was repeating. "That's not," he started, and stopped because there was nothing to argue with. It was his mother's handwriting. It was his own mother's voice. And it was, God help him, the exact word he'd used on me 5 days earlier, laughing over a stack of dishes in our own kitchen. "You said it to Dana," Carol said quietly. "Not cruel, just certain. I heard about it from Wendy this week when she was planning all this. The second she told me, I knew. I knew before I even wrote the card down. I wasn't trying to." Grant's voice broke fully now, and he looked, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely lost. A grown man standing in his aunt's, his friends, his wife's sister's living room, holding proof that he'd become, word for word, the thing he'd spent his whole adult life insisting he wasn't. I stood up from the couch, slower than I would have liked, one hand on the armrest, and everyone's eyes moved to me at once. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already so quiet that a whisper would have carried. "I didn't bring you here to punish you, Grant," I said. "I brought you here to run one party. One. And you couldn't even do that without 3 separate emergencies, because you have spent 7 months treating basic effort like it's optional for you and mandatory for me. I've been asking for help since July. You called it milking it. You called me territorial. You called me useless in our own kitchen 5 days ago, and then you laughed. I didn't manufacture this. Your own mother wrote that card before she knew what you'd said this week. I just made sure you'd finally have to hear it, in a room full of people who love you, instead of getting to erase it later the way you erase everything else you don't want to look at." Nobody moved. Grant looked down at the card again, then at his mother, then at me, and for once in 7 months he didn't have a joke or an excuse or a wounded shrug ready to go. "I didn't know," he said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. About what he said. "I never knew that." "I know," Carol said, and her composure finally cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. "I kept the letters he sent you over the years too, in a shoebox in your closet. I always thought if you ever wanted them, you'd ask, and you never did, and I didn't know how to bring it up without bringing up the rest of it too." I saw Grant's eyes flick to me then, understanding dawning that I'd known about the shoebox, that I'd asked, that his mother had told me to leave it be, while apparently deciding, in her own time, on her own terms, that this was how it would finally come out. Not gently, in private, but in the middle of a baby shower. shower. Over a game meant to teach her son to bring his pregnant wife a glass of water. He set the last card down on the coffee table like it weighed more than the cake he'd carried through the rain that morning. Carol reached over then and took the card back gently from his hands, folding it once along its original crease, and held it against her chest for a moment before setting it down on the coffee table beside the others. It was such a small gesture, but it told the whole room something none of the words had quite managed to, that she wasn't performing this either, that it had cost her every bit as much to write that card as it had cost Grant to read it. Nobody clapped, nobody laughed. Grandma Fran, from her armchair by the window, was the first to speak into the silence, and what she said wasn't comfort. "Well," she said, in the flat, dry voice of a woman who had buried a husband and outlived 2 of her own siblings and had no patience left for pretending. "Now you know. Question is what you do next." My mother, who had been quiet the whole afternoon, finally spoke, her hand still wrapped around mine. "Nobody in this room thinks less of you for having a father who left Grant," she said. "We'd think less of you for turning into him on purpose, now that you know better." It wasn't gentle. It wasn't meant to be. Nobody in that living room corrected her. What Grant did next, in the immediate minutes after, was leave the room. Not storm out. He wasn't performing anger. Not this time. Just walked down the hallway and stood alone in Wendy's laundry room with the door half shut, and nobody followed him right away, because everybody in that living room understood, without needing to say it, that some things a person has to sit with by themselves first. The party didn't fully recover. Not in the way parties are supposed to. People stayed a while longer out of politeness, ate cake, admired the tiny sage green onesies I'd registered for, but the air had changed, and everyone could feel it. My mother found me in the kitchen 20 minutes later and just held my hand for a second, saying nothing, which was somehow the exact right amount. Trevor wasn't at the shower. Grant hadn't invited him. Said it was a women thing, mostly, though 31 guests had included at least a dozen men. But he texted Grant that night, and Grant, still raw, showed me the message a few days later like he needed someone to witness it existed. "Dude, I told you to get your act together in October. I meant it. That's on you, not her." It surprised me. I'd filed Trevor away, all those months ago, as part of the problem. The buddy who laughed along with milking it. Turned out he'd been telling Grant something different in private the whole time, and Grant had simply chosen, the way he chose most inconvenient truths, not to hear it. Carol called me 2 days after the shower, not to apologize for the card. She never apologized for the card, and I respected that, but to ask, carefully, cautiously, if I wanted her to come stay with us for a few weeks once the baby came. Not to fix anything between me and Grant, she said, just so I'd have another set of hands that actually functioned. I should have said something to him years ago, she told me on the phone, her voice tired in a way I'd never heard from her. I kept thinking if I just quietly did the things he wouldn't, it would spare him from ever having to be his father. I think I just taught him he'd never have to be anyone at all. You were doing what you could with what you had, I told her, and meant it. You raised him alone on a receptionist's paycheck. Nobody handed you a better option. Maybe not, she said, but I could have handed him a harder one, somewhere along the way, and I didn't. That's on me, not just him. I didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she wanted one. I think she just needed to say it out loud to somebody who'd understand exactly what it cost her. Grant didn't come home Saturday night at all. He texted at nearly midnight to say he was staying at Trevor's, that he needed to think, and I lay in our bed alone with my hand on my stomach and felt something in me go quiet and clear, in a way it hadn't been in months. I wasn't afraid of what came next. That surprised me more than anything else that whole week. He stayed at Trevor's for 4 nights. Trevor, it turned out, wasn't interested in being a hideout. He told Grant, in words Grant repeated to me later with visible discomfort, that he could crash on the couch, but he wasn't going to sit around agreeing that Dana had done something unfair, because from where Trevor was standing, she'd been more than fair for longer than he deserved. "Man told me I'd been getting away with stuff since high school," Grant said, sitting at our kitchen table the following Wednesday, looking like he hadn't slept much in any of the nights between. Said he should have said something a long time ago instead of laughing along on the phone that day. He also, in those 4 days at Trevor's, called his manager at Cardinal and asked for the first time in his career there about the company's paternity leave policy. 2 weeks paid, which he'd apparently never bothered to look up in 3 years of employment, assuming without checking that it didn't apply to him the way it obviously would to me. He filed the paperwork himself, no reminders from me this time, and came home the 5th day with a printed confirmation email he set on the kitchen counter without a word, like evidence in a case he knew he still had to build. He moved back home on the 5th day, into the guest room. His own decision, not mine, though I didn't argue against it. We started seeing a marriage counselor recommended by a woman at my firm, a specialist named Dr. Okafor, who worked mostly with couples navigating what she called invisible labor resentment, and the first session was mostly Grant sitting silent, staring at his own hands, while I did most of the talking. We also talked, in that same stretch of sessions, about the blood pressure logs from November, the reminders he never set, and Dr. Okafor asked him to explain, without defending himself, why he thought he'd dismissed a legitimate medical concern about his wife's health 3 separate times. He didn't have a good answer. He said, eventually, that some part of him hadn't wanted to believe anything could actually be wrong, because believing it meant he'd have to change how he spent his days, and it had felt easier to just decide the doctor was being overly cautious. It wasn't a satisfying answer. Dr. Okafor told him so directly, and for once he didn't argue with her either. She asked him, before we left that day, to say out loud what he thought might might have happened if my numbers had kept climbing and nobody but me had been paying attention. He couldn't finish the sentence. I watched him try twice and give up both times. And for the first time in the whole process, I saw something on his face that looked less like guilt and more like fear. Real fear. The kind that might actually stick. In the third session, Dr. Okafor asked him directly what he thought useless had meant when he said it, and he sat with the question for a long, uncomfortable minute before answering. I think I meant I felt useless, he said finally. Watching you do everything right and me do everything wrong. It was easier to point it at you than sit in it myself. It wasn't an excuse. Dr. Okafor didn't let him treat it like one, and to his credit, he didn't seem to want her to. It got easier slowly, session by session, though easier is a relative word when you're 8 months pregnant. Crying in a therapist's office about a word your husband used over a stack of dishes. There were complications that had nothing to do with feelings. His uncle Denny, Carol's older brother, heard a secondhand version of the shower from someone's cousin and called the house to tell Grant he thought the whole thing had been a public ambush. That family business belonged behind closed doors, and the two of them didn't speak for 6 weeks afterward. Carol, when she heard about the call, phoned her brother herself and told him, in a conversation Grant wasn't present for but heard about from his grandmother, that if he wanted to defend a grown man for calling his pregnant wife useless, he could do it somewhere she didn't have to listen. Denny sent Grant a birthday card that spring anyway. No mention of any of it, and Grant taped it to the fridge like nothing had happened. And I understood, watching him do it, that some family rifts just get quietly absorbed rather than resolved, the same way so much else in that family always had been. He read the letters. All of them, finally, alone in the guest room one night in January, and came out an hour later with red eyes and told me, in pieces, what was in them. His father, it turned out, had tried, intermittently, badly, across 2 decades, birthdays and graduations he'd never shown up for in person, but apparently hadn't entirely forgotten either. A coward's version of trying that never once translated into action. Grant didn't reach out to him. He said he wasn't ready, might never be ready, and I told him that was allowed, that some doors you're entitled to leave shut. Roger reached out anyway. In February, a single card in unfamiliar handwriting that arrived at Carol's house addressed to Grant, congratulating him on the baby he'd apparently heard about from a cousin neither of them had spoken to in years. No return address, no phone number, just a line at the bottom that said, "I think about you more than you'd believe." Grant read it twice at Carol's kitchen table, folded it back into its envelope, and put it in the same shoebox with the others, unanswered, and told me that night he thought that was probably where it was always going to stay. I didn't push him one way or the other. It wasn't mine to push. I consulted quietly with a colleague at Hobart and Klein about updating my own beneficiary designations and the life insurance policy through my job, not because I'd decided anything final about the marriage, but because pregnancy and a public unraveling had taught me, in the space of 1 week, exactly how much I'd been operating on trust alone. She walked me through opening a savings account in my name only, separate from the baby fund, funded automatically from every paycheck before Grant ever saw the balance, and helped me understand, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, exactly what our joint accounts actually protected and what they didn't. It felt less like preparing for a divorce and more like, finally, for the first time in 3 years, putting my own name in the owner column of something. Grant found out about the account in March, not because I hid it well, but because I didn't try very hard to. He asked about it at the kitchen table, quiet, careful, the golf membership version of him nowhere in the room. "Is this you leaving?" he asked. "Or you protecting yourself either way?" I told him the truth, both a little. Protecting myself didn't require deciding anything yet about the leaving, and for once he didn't argue that it should. Priya called me the week after the shower, having heard about it from someone who'd heard about it from someone else. The way news like that travels through a friend group in less than 72 hours, no matter how private you meant it to stay. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "I'm sorry I laughed at that penguin joke," which told me she'd clearly done some accounting of her own since November, and then she asked what she could actually do, practically, in the weeks before the baby came. I told her the truth, that I mostly needed someone to sit with me at the pediatrician meet and greet appointment in February, since I still wasn't sure I trusted Grant to show up on time for anything with a scheduled start. He surprised me. He came 20 minutes early, sat in the waiting room reading pamphlets about newborn sleep like they were scripture, and asked the pediatrician more questions than I did. It wasn't proof of anything permanent. I'd learned by then not to treat one good appointment as a verdict, but I let myself notice it anyway, the way you notice a single warm day in the middle of a long Ohio February, without pretending it means winter's over. There was a night in late January, alone in the nursery painting a second coat of sage green over the spot Grant had missed back in October, when I let myself grieve fully for the version of him I'd married in that backyard in North Canton, the one who'd cried in the bathroom in July and meant it, the one who'd said we're really doing this like it was a promise instead of a phrase he'd forget how to keep. That man wasn't gone exactly, but I understood finally that he'd never fully arrived either. Not on his own, not without a living room full of witnesses and a card in his mother's handwriting to force the reckoning. Something real had been lost in getting here. I let myself feel that, sitting on the floor of a nursery that smelled like paint, before I got up, washed the brush, and went to bed. Nora Frances Sorensen was born on the 9th of April, 8 days past her due date, 6 pounds 11 ounces, with Grant's stubborn chin and my mother's dark hair. Her middle name was Grant's idea, not mine, offered quietly one night in March with no fanfare. A small, unprompted acknowledgement of whose steadiness had actually carried that family for 30 years. Carol cried when she heard it, longer and harder than I'd ever seen her cry about anything. He was there for the birth, every hour of it, no phone in his hand, holding my leg and telling me I was doing incredible when I genuinely thought I couldn't do one more push. Somewhere around hour 11, delirious with exhaustion, I remember him running down the hospital hallway to find a nurse because I'd asked for ice chips, and he didn't want to wait for the call button. And I remember thinking, even through the pain, that it was such a small thing to notice, and such a strange thing to feel so much relief over. I won't pretend that erased anything. It didn't. But it was, at least, a start that actually looked like one. These days when I'm tired, he brings me water before I have to ask twice. It's not everything. It's not the marriage I pictured in that bathroom on Larkmore Lane back in July. The one where we meant equal from the start, instead of equal after a public humiliation forced it into existence. We're still in counseling most Thursdays, and some weeks are better than others. And I've stopped expecting the kind of clean, total redemption you see in movies, because real people don't work that way. And I'd rather have the honest, uneven version than a performance of one. Carol comes by most Sundays now, and she and Grant talk more than they used to. Careful, unfinished conversations that circle around Roger without ever quite landing anywhere final. The shoebox sits on a shelf in our closet these days, not hidden anymore, just there. Its lid a little more worn than it used to be from being opened. Wendy still brings a deck of index cards to every family gathering as a joke now, holding them up and grinning at Grant from across whatever room we're in, and he always groans, and always, without fail, laughs along with it, which is its own small kind of proof that he's stopped being afraid of what that day cost him. Priya asked me recently, half joking, whether I'd do it again, the shower, the cards, all of it, if I had it to plan over. I told her the truth. I'd do almost everything the same, except maybe I'd have found a gentler room to do it in, if I'd known back then that gentleness was even still an option. At the time, I didn't think it was. I think I was right not to think so. Some ceilings only break when you stop being careful about where the pieces land. I think about that card sometimes, the one in Carol's handwriting, and about the word Grant used on me over a stack of dirty dishes. The same word his father used on her 30-some years before I was even born. I think about how close I came to just filing that night away too, the way I'd filed 100 smaller ones before it, and letting it become one more thing I quietly absorbed instead of the thing that finally made me stop absorbing. I wasn't useless. I was never useless. I was the only one working for months, while someone I loved called it milking it and laughed. What I learned in that living room full of 31 people who loved him is that some men don't change because you ask nicely enough, or often enough, or gently enough. Sometimes they only change when the truth gets loud enough that they can't step around it anymore, when it's sitting in their own mother's handwriting, in a room full of people whose good opinion they can't afford to lose. I got that room. I got that word said back to him, in his mother's voice instead of mine, and it cost all of us something to get there. Her 30 years of silence, his sudden public unmaking, my own quiet mourning for the marriage I thought I had. None of it came free. I don't know that I'd recommend it as a plan to anyone in the position I was in, only that I understand now why I chose it, and I've stopped apologizing for the choice, even to myself. Even on the nights it still feels like too much to have needed 31 witnesses to get my own husband to hear me. But I have a daughter now who reaches for water on her own high shelf someday and won't have to ask twice if her father has anything to say about it, and most days, that feels like enough of a beginning to build the rest on. I still keep the file, out of habit more than necessity these days, the small mental ledger of things said and things done, filed away instead of thought about in the moment. It's gotten thinner since April. Some months it doesn't grow at all. I've learned to let that be its own kind of good news, instead of waiting, the way I used to, for proof it wouldn't last.